Bleeding Kansas, a prelude to the American Civil War. The term Bleeding Kansas, coined by the New York Tribune in 1856, refers to the violent struggle in the Kansas Territory between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. This conflict, which lasted until Kansas joined the Union as a free state in 1861, served as a dress rehearsal for the American Civil War, revealing the depth of national division over slavery. Under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, settlers were to decide through popular sovereignty whether slavery would be allowed. This opened the floodgates for both pro- and anti-slavery supporters to move into Kansas in hopes of tipping the vote. Pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri crossed into Kansas to vote illegally and intimidate opponents, escalating tensions that would lead to years of bloodshed. The roots of conflict. The roots of the conflict trace back to earlier national debates over slavery. The 1787 Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in new northern territories, and Congress ended the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. While slavery withered in the industrial North, it remained central to Southern agricultural economies, especially after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. The Louisiana Purchase, 1803, raised questions about whether new territories would allow slavery. The Missouri Compromise, 1820, tried to maintain balance by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state while banning slavery north of the 36° parallel. The Compromise of 1850, following the Mexican-American War, allowed popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico and passed the controversial Fugitive Slave Act, which required free states to help return escaped slaves. Senator Stephen A. Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed the Missouri Compromise, allowing settlers in those territories to decide on slavery themselves. Since both territories were north of the 36°30' line, it was assumed they would be free, but Kansas's proximity to Missouri made it a battleground. The struggle begins 1854-1856. In 1854, pro-slavery Missourians settled Atchison and Leavenworth, while anti-slavery settlers founded Lawrence and Topeka. The first territorial election in November 1854 was marred by fraud and violence, with Missourians crossing the border to vote illegally. A congressional investigation confirmed the fraud, leading to a second vote in March 1855, which was also manipulated. Kansas soon had two rival governments, the pro-slavery capital at Lecompton and the free state government in Lawrence. The Wakarusa War, 1855, marked the first major clash. A free stater, Charles Dow, was killed by a pro-slavery settler in a personal dispute that escalated due to political tensions. When a free stater who witnessed the murder was arrested, anti-slavery settlers freed him, prompting an armed standoff. The conflict ended in a truce brokered by Governor Wilson Shannon, but tensions remained high. Escalating violence, 1856-1859. On May 21, 1856, pro-slavery forces sacked Lawrence, destroying anti-slavery presses and buildings. The following day, Senator Preston Brooks of South Carolina brutally beat abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor in response to Sumner's anti-slavery speech, an event that further inflamed tensions. In retaliation, radical abolitionist John Brown led the Pottawatomie Massacre on May 24th, killing 5 pro-slavery settlers. Violence surged throughout the summer, culminating in the Battle of Osawatomie, August 30th, 1856. Brown and a small group of defenders fought off a much larger force led by Missouri slaveholder John W. Reed. Although they were eventually overwhelmed and the town burned, the incident boosted Brown's legend and deepened the conflict. The Dred Scott decision and continued violence. The 1857 Dred Scott v. Sanford decision intensified the national crisis. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that African Americans were not citizens and had no legal standing, and that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories. The decision emboldened pro-slavery advocates and led to renewed violence in Kansas. In May 1858, pro-slavery leader Charles Hamilton led the Marais des Cygnes massacre, executing 5 free staters and wounding 5 more in retaliation for his earlier exile. Later that year, abolitionist Dr. John Doy and his son were captured while escorting escaped slaves. Though Charles was released, John was sentenced to hard labor, prompting a daring rescue by a group later known as the Immortal Ten. The final days of Bleeding Kansas smaller events, such as the Battle of the Spurs in January 1859, kept tensions high. In that incident, John Brown successfully led 11 fugitive slaves past a posse of U.S. Marshals without firing a shot, earning the battle its name due to the speed with which the Marshals fled. Brown would later leave Kansas to launch his infamous 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, but violence in Kansas continued until the outbreak of the Civil War. Ultimately, Kansas entered the Union as a free state in 1861 and remained staunchly Republican and anti-slavery throughout the war. It became the first state to recruit black soldiers into its army. Though the most intense phase of Bleeding Kansas lasted from 1854 to 1859, hostilities did not fully end until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery nationwide. The events in Kansas had demonstrated clearly that the issue of slavery could not be resolved peacefully, only through war. Conclusion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 ignited the violent struggle known as Bleeding Kansas, a conflict that persisted in various forms until the end of the Civil War in 1865. The act not only intensified the national debate over slavery, but also catalyzed the formation of the Republican Party, which quickly gained momentum by opposing the expansion of slavery into Western territories. Abolitionists increasingly aligned with the Republican cause, positioning themselves in direct opposition to the pro-slavery Southern Democrats. In Kansas, Republican support steadily grew from 1854 to 1859. Historian James McPherson notes, Free State Kansans organized a Republican Party and elected two-thirds of the delegates to a new constitutional convention in 1859. Kansas finally came in as a free state in January 1861, joining California, Minnesota, and Oregon, whose entry since the Mexican War had given the North a four-state edge over the South. Kansas also became one of the most Republican states in the Union. Though most of the free state settlers had originally been Democrats, the struggle with the slave power pushed them into the Republican Party. McPherson 169. Kansas maintained its Republican and anti-slavery stance throughout the Civil War and became the first state to organize and deploy black soldiers, forming the 1st and 2nd Kansas Colored Infantry Regiments as early as 1862. The same partisan and ideological violence that characterized Bleeding Kansas continued throughout the war years, a reality reflected in popular culture through films like The Outlaw Josie Wales, 1976, and Ride with the Devil, 1999. While the American Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, the conflict had already begun in spirit years earlier on the plains of Kansas, where neighbor fought neighbor over the future of slavery in America.